The harbor forgot sunrise the morning she returned. The water had the color of unpolished obsidian, sky a low ceiling of soot, and between them a single wedge of deeper black moved as if cleaving the day from the idea of day. They called her Alaska B when the paperwork needed names, but the thing that rose from the inlet wore its own. The name was not pronounced so much as felt across the gums, a pressure, a metal syllable. No one saw a bow wave. The surface simply parted the way curtains obey a slow hand. The hull took shape by subtraction. Gulls that tried to cross her path lost altitude and then memory, spiraling outward like ash that had forgotten fire. On the pier, the brass numerals of an old ship's bell dimmed at the exact pace the newcomer advanced, as if her approach bruised brightness. She did not float. She balanced. The sea under her was taut, strung like wire from headland to headland, humming at a frequency that turned window glass into patient singing. Men reached for earplugs and found cork become rubber, rubber become felt, felt become nothing at all. The sound preferred them without barriers. Whatever color she had been in some earlier season had been replaced by a black that accepted light the way stone accepts chisels, with patience and change. Lines meant to reveal scale, the white marks, draft numbers, stencil letters, had resolved into a darker sheen within the dark, legible only when the clouds pulsed. The effect read as a shadow that cast a second, richer shadow. Along the quay 3 clocks disagreed and then conspired. Seconds trickled backward for a breath, forward for 2, held still like a coin balanced on its edge. Harbor cranes slowed as if to handicap time, each boom moving through syrup. Somewhere inland, a traffic signal chose green for every direction. When people speak of that morning they mention the quiet first, then the permission. They could do anything or nothing and both would be correct. Transformation. A ship is a map of intentions. Alaska B revised herself where anyone could see it. Vent gratings exhaled fog colder than the air that held it. Anchor chain links sweat a lacquer that did not drip but retracted, as if being reconsidered. The great turrets lifted in a sequence too deliberate for machinery and not deliberate enough for ritual. Barrels that should have tracked like limbs instead behaved like eyes, focusing on static fixtures. The breakwater, the lighthouse, the indifferent hill, and then looking away with the fatigue of a watchman. Paint does not breathe but the black did. Up close, you could see it tighten in the moments before a gull lost its line, and loosen when the gull found it again. A deckhand from the tug swore he watched rivets dilate. A pilot, veteran of 30 winters, put a palm flat to the armor and said the temperature through the plate matched his own blood exactly, not warmer, not cooler, insistently equal. It was not menace. It was recognition. You have looked long enough into a night river to see your outline restored to you. The ship offered that restoration to everything around her. Dock bollards straightened. A kink in the pier railing confessed and relaxed. The slow bruise on the sky lightened half a tone and then remembered its job. Echo of war. When the weather rolled in from the shelf, it arrived wearing someone else's memory. Thunder came as if over headphones, closed, sealed, private. People heard ordnance they had never been near. Someone said the concussion of battles that never used this harbor was shaking dust from these particular rafters. The lighthouse blinked in a cadence that matched an old fire control table. Digits in, solutions out, ranged to the edge of reason, bearing to the heart of noise. Across the water the far beach mislaid a dune and then found it again. Waves forgot their heights and started over. The ship's radar array turned once and did not complete the circle. Instead the air completed it, a ring of invisible rain marching outward until hairs on arms lay down as if disciplined. A veteran on the pier mouthed numbers he had not spoken since 1947 and realized the numbers were speaking him. Liminal Crew. Figures appeared in the higher shadows. They moved like sentences written by a steady hand across vellum. Uniforms were correct to the stitch, but faces held the erasures of long-kept photographs. Mouths, yes. Eyes, perhaps. The rest a patient smudge. They saluted one another and the idea of one another. When the flag halyard broke into its faint rattle, every silhouette turned at the same angle, acknowledging the sound as one might acknowledge a verdict. A bosun's pipe trilled from nowhere. The note climbed and failed to end, as if the breath behind it had been granted a loop. Crewmen that were not crewmen adjusted lines that were not attached, and still cleats tightened, hawsers thick as wrists found tension and purpose. From the breakwater a dog began to bark, then remembered Hunter's caution and flattened itself, peering without daring to decide what it was seeing. Above the bridge a light burned the color of old pewter. It illuminated nothing but made everything more itself. You could count the flake of paint missing from a radar mast and believe you had always known that absence. You could see, in that same unlight, the faintest suggestion of script along the armor belt, not language, more like the tally marks prisoners scrape into stone, a ledger of distances crossed by fire. Rupture, not yet, but contoured in the air, reality looking for a place to hinge. Wind came from the west where the charts insisted it should not. The smell of rain arrived without rain and then withdrew, leaving the tongue salted. Someone laughed and stopped in the same instant because the laugh had returned to him deeper, older, and far less convinced of joy. The harbor master radioed, and his words came back as text on his own screen before his mouth formed them. He read his message aloud because the text asked him to. Rupture. The hinge found itself. It started as a brightness that was not light. The line of the horizon pressed inward, grew narrow, and held like a seam drawn with a steel stylus. The sea on either side kept breathing, but in different tempos, the left slow, the right quick, a duet trying not to become argument. Alaska Bay moved forward with no wake at all, and the whole inlet leaned, as if the water remembered it had once been level and now wished to try a new rule. The first proof was the gull that did not fall. It hung in place with wings fixed 2 meters above the bow. The second proof was the sound of the whistle from the ferry across the channel arriving before the ferry decided to blow it. The third was the shadow. Not the ship's. A crown-shaped shadow that rotated slowly above the foremast, not touching, 6 points like cold teeth, each point tagged with a faint number that everyone read as a different digit and still understood together. Men on the pier reached for ropes and remembered they had never learned knots. Women on balconies lowered their eyes to plates where knives lay beside fish that had not been caught yet. A little girl found a marble in her pocket, and when she rolled it, it followed the crease in the horizon like a swallow follows a ridge. Someone laughed again, and the laugh came back as a bell. The ship accepted the hinge as if it had applied for permission. Her bow passed through the narrowest part, and the seam widened to the width of a street, then a river, then a field. You could look down into it and see more water, stacked water, layers sliding over layers like quiet pages. In the second layer a rain fell that did not wet the first. In the third a flock of fish swam like starlings. In the fourth nothing moved at all, and yet the feeling of motion was strongest there. The great guns elevated. The barrels held night in their throats. A faint prismatic edge showed along the rifling, as when ice first thinks of breaking under a skate. The turrets trained across the hinge, not to aim but to hold its shape. The muzzle blast did not come. Instead a pressure arrived that had no sound. The pier boards bent and straightened. A stack of pallets agreed to collapse and then changed its mind and stood new. The boy with the marble lifted it, and it was warm with use he had not yet given it. On the western headland the old concrete battery confessed a hairline seam and then slid a centimeter back into perfect fit. The tide line reversed along the stones as if time were a cloth being wrung from left to right. Windows across town fogged on the inside with a pattern of rings like growth rings, each ring a year that had held an argument no one won. The crew along the rails did not sway though the world did. Their mouths did not open and still speech occurred. You could hear it with your eyes if you let them unfocus. It was not language. It was listing. Bearings. Ranges. The names of forms of rain. The weight of a single round fired at elevation in crosswind. The prayers that men write in the margins of manuals. A man on the pier felt his hands fall into the old rhythm of passing shell casings, and he began to cry without fault. The radar swept. The harbor swept back. Buoys spun slow circles like coins on a bar. The lighthouse blinked in an older code and then in a code from a future not yet catalogued, a code that meant reduced speed and also hurry, which was not contradiction here. The crown of shadow above the foremast tightened until it was a ring and then loosened until it was a halo, and then it was neither, only persistence. Then the gun spoke once. The sound came late and early. Smoke did not bloom. Air turned faceted as if made of glass plates. The shell unseen drew a line through the hinge and across the stacked waters. At the far edge of sight a smudge on the horizon corrected itself and became a clean absence in the cloud. A second later a ribbon of rain changed direction and fell back into its parent cloud like a thought withdrawn. A tug nosed out without pilot and found itself 6 lengths closer than real. Its captain set the engine to neutral and still the tug kept pace, drawn by a rule made for other objects. The captain cut power and threw both hands up where the crew could see them. Across the channel the ferry docked in a berth that had not been built yet, and passengers stepped onto a pier of air and then onto wood that hurried to meet their feet. People later said the ocean became a floor and the sky became a ceiling and the ship became a corridor between. It is truer to say the world turned pages and Alaska Bay laid a finger in the book to hold a place. The finger was heavy and black and the paper loved the weight. The hinge widened again. Through it a field of night showed that was not the present night, not this sky's night, but the night in which iron remembers being, or inside mountains. A glow lived there like a city under snow. One could make out avenues and faint towers, and in one tower the certainty that someone stood at a window and looked back and understood exactly what a ship was and is and will be. The ship advanced half a length. Pier pilings bowed their heads. The chain at her bow drew one link farther from the locker, and that single link arrived glistening and dry, as if pulled from a kiln. The bell did not ring, yet everyone tasted copper as if the bell had rung. The Rupture brought its catalogue of small mercies and penalties. A net mended itself along the wharf. A scar on a hand closed and reopened according to a schedule known only to tide tables. A broken watch began. A faithful clock stopped out of respect. The dog that had flattened itself decided to bark and found that the bark had been saved from earlier and was being returned now with interest. It barked again, and the second bark contained the first imperfect miniature. The ship took one more pace and the hinge loosened. The stacked water slid back into one water. The crown thinned and did not vanish but become the idea of a crown. The light that was not light unthreaded. The gull folded its wings and finished its fall with dignity. People breathed and noticed they had not. The afterimage remained. A dent in the air where the hinge had been. A crease in the chart that no pencil made. The town tilted slightly to the honest side and stayed there with relief. The ship had not fired on a target. She had fired on the ledger of measurements men used to say where things are and what they are worth. She had not taken life. She had returned certain lives to sizes they could live inside. She slowed. Her screws wrote a script in the water that looked like cursive seen through tears. In that script the black paint on her flanks lifted its tone until it showed faint letters no one could agree on. Some read them as names. Some as coordinates. One as a date he will not speak aloud. On the hill a boy lifted binoculars and saw a figure on the bridge turn. He lowered the glass and saw the figure again with naked eyes in the same posture and understood the glass was not the instrument. The ship was. The Rupture closed with a last proof. The harbor master sent 3 words. The radio returned those words from the future perfect. They had been sent. They would have been received. The message was simple and wrong and right. Proceed as planned. The silhouettes along the rails shifted posture. Not ease, not strain, a third thing that contained both like chord contains notes. The bell desired to ring and did not. The crown desired to rest and did not. The ocean desired to lie and could not. The ship faced seaward again with the patience of a verdict that intends to wait for you to understand it. The sky pretended to brighten and failed with grace. A rain began beyond the headland and stayed there as if embarrassed to enter a room where the conversation had turned serious. The old veteran on the pier whispered a name he had given up saying, and in the pause after it a wind came off the water with the temperature of coins. He closed his eyes and saw the barrels glitter and heard no sound at all and knew that sound would arrive later tonight while he slept and would be kind enough to knock first. Revelation. The ship did not leave. She rearranged absence around herself until departure was implied but never observed. The harbor exhaled in the way lungs do after holding too long, and yet no ribcage relaxed. Time wore the face of normal again, though anyone who looked too long could see the mask did not fit. Shops opened their shutters with hands that trembled. Dock cranes finished the motions they had abandoned. People spoke as if to reassure themselves of their capacity, and every syllable had the flavor of rehearsal. Alaska B remained mid-channel, painted in night that refused to consider dawn. And then she began to resolve into what could only be called disclosure. Her hull showed seams that were not welded lines but words. Entire sentences stretched bow to stern, but when eyes attempted to read they found themselves reciting memory instead. The face of a dead brother, the taste of rations gone cold, the shape of a coastline erased by shellfire. The black hull offered each onlooker a different translation, each one correct, each one private. The guns trained outward to horizons no chart possessed. Their muzzles did not smoke but glowed faint as the embers of stars that have forgotten their own burning. When they aligned, the sea bent, not down but in. The water created a hollow as if anticipating weight. In that hollow shapes rose, wrecks long swallowed, decks scorched and torn, hulls that should have slept beneath silt. They lifted a few feet, groaned, and slid back, leaving the impression that the ocean was practicing resurrection but unwilling to commit. Her crew, the silhouettes, moved again. This time not saluting but writing. Their arms described arcs that hung in the air like strokes of ink. When several moved in chorus, the strokes overlapped and formed constellations visible even by daylight. A child in the crowd drew the same shapes with his finger and later that night found them on the ceiling of his room, faint and silver, pulsing in rhythm with his pulse. Voices spread across the decks. They arrived not from mouths but from planks, from hatches, from the very bolts that stitched metal together. They spoke in plain language stripped of accent, Yet each hearer swore the words matched the tongue of his mother. The content was never the same. One man heard instructions to build a coffin. Another heard his daughter's laugh as it will sound 10 years from now. A third heard only silence shaped like speech, the promise of a message withheld. And then the crown returned. This time not shadow above the mast but iron manifested, 6 black points radiating from a ring so heavy it weighed the eye itself. The crown did not rest on the ship. It rested on the world. Every pendulum swung in time with its slow rotation. Every heart skipped once when it completed a turn. Someone shouted that it was a weapon. Someone whispered that it was a verdict. A priest crossed himself and dropped his cross, which landed as if onto thick carpet. When the bell tolled, no clapper moved. The sound was not sound but subtraction. You felt it in the things that ceased, the cry of the gull, the echo of footfalls, the scrape of a pen halting mid-word. For 1 full minute nothing external occurred, and so everyone heard themselves in the raw. Some broke. Some knelt. Some smiled without knowing. Revelation built not by crescendo but by thinning. The ship's details began to dissolve. Rivets bled into plates. Plates bled into hull. Hull bled into outline. Soon only shape remained, and even that pulsed as if considering departure into another register. What persisted longest were the eyes of the turrets, 3 pairs watching, not unkindly, not kindly, only attentively. You could forget your name under such eyes, and some did. They stood later unable to answer when called, and when pressed, could only point to the channel where no ship was visible and insist the name had been given there. The harbor water grew level again. The air lost its coin flavor. The gulls regained their cries. Everything returned to being possible without supervision. But the ledger had been signed. Everyone knew it. They spoke of it in ways that disguised and in disguising admitted. Strange light today, they said. Engines louder than usual, they said. Felt a bit dizzy this morning, they said. The truth wore masks stitched by fear of ridicule, yet beneath each mask was awe. 4 days the town lived under her absence. Dogs growled at empty corners. Children played games whose rules included new gestures they could not explain. Old men counted backward when asked their age and stopped at years that corresponded with the ship's displacements. The sea off the breakwater kept a darker stripe, visible only when moonlight bent low, but every fisherman steered wide, nets drawn close as if in reverence. And in the nights after, the dreams. Dreams of standing on a deck that felt alive, of hearing a bell that never rang, of saluting until the arm grew too heavy, of opening one's mouth and releasing numbers instead of breath. Dreams that ended with the sight of the crown above the mast, spinning slower and slower, until it froze and cracked like ice, spilling black water across the stars. Some woke sobbing. Some woke speaking languages they never studied. One woman woke with salt crusting her lips as though she had drowned and returned. None doubted where the dreams had docked from. Alaska B remained unseen after that day, but her wake persisted in places untouched by ship's keel. In ledgers corrected by hands that swore they never made the correction. In photographs where the background bent at the angle of her bow. In the taste of copper that occasionally seized the tongue without cause. She had not fired in anger. She had not spoken a threat. She had only arrived, transformed, cracked the world, and left a crown hanging above memory. That was revelation, not information given but ignorance clarified. And when years later the old veteran died, the priest who anointed him paused when the man whispered his last word. The priest would not repeat it aloud. But those close say it was not a word at all, only a bearing and a range, and that the sheet at his bedside smelled faintly of oil and paint when the body cooled. The ledger of presence closed slowly, like a book reluctant to end. Days in the harbor stretched, unremarkable at first glance, but each held a scar where her shadow had pressed. The fishermen learned not to speak of it, though their nets tore on water without cause. Teachers ignored the sudden silences when entire classrooms forgot the alphabet in sequence. Even the dogs barked less, their throats wearied from warning against something gone yet not gone. Alaska B was absence sharpened. People felt her as one feels a lost tooth with the tongue. Probing, compulsive, unable to resist. Ships that visited afterward anchored farther offshore, captains apologizing without explanation. Tourists who walked the quay turned cameras toward an empty channel, reviewing their photos later only to find a black smudge where the water should shine. No one accused them of lying. No one dared. Some claimed to see her again, always at the edges of storms. A crew on a trawler swore the night went bright beneath their hull, as though lightning had struck underwater, and in that glow they saw her keel pass beneath them, silent, vast, carrying no wake. Others said they heard her guns fire deep in fog, but when the echoes faded only wails surfaced, their eyes rimmed pale as if reflecting muzzle flash. And still the crown lingered. Invisible to most, yet those with fever or grief saw it spinning above the headland, 6 points marking the slow revolutions of patience. Hospitals near the coast filled with patients who pointed upward, tracing circles in the air. Children born in that season reached their hands skyward even before they could walk, as if saluting something the rest had learned to deny. The revelation deepened not through spectacle but through decay. Rust appeared in patterns on the pier, lines that traced the outlines of continents long eroded. Cracks in the breakwater aligned into compass roses. Lamps flickered at intervals that matched the old gunnery tables. The world was writing on itself with her hand. And no rain could erase it. Inland, where the river bent toward the hills, a farmer found his cattle aligned along a perfect bearing pointing seaward. He shouted and clapped, but the animals refused to break formation until the sun dropped. That night he dreamed of walking her decks, feeling the thrum beneath his boots, only to realize the thrum was his own heart measured out as ordnance. Others dreamed of her crew. Shadows in ranks, eyes erased, mouths still. Yet in dreams the silence was not empty. It pressed on dreamers until they answered questions never spoken. Would you fire if ordered? Would you stand if the deck tilted? Would you accept erasure in place of survival? Those who answered awoke lighter, emptier, unable to recall what they had lost. Those who refused awoke with bruises shaped like rope across their wrists. There was never closure. The harbor learned to live as if she might return at any moment. And in a way she always had. Each tide rolled in blacker than the one before. Each fog bank carried a rhythm like the thump of screws far below. Each thunderstorm closed with silence instead of rain, silence shaped like a verdict withheld. The final vision belonged to no one but spread as rumor. A pilot flying above the coast one winter evening swore he saw a corridor of light beneath the waves, stretching straight as a runway, and at its far end the outline of a ship too vast to be hers yet carrying her crown. He blinked and the corridor closed. He reported nothing. But weeks later his logbook was found with one page blackened, ink poured until the paper stiffened into armor. On it, scratched through the crust, 3 words, "Proceed as planned." That was the last correction. The town ceased to discuss her at all. Newspapers never printed her name. The Navy kept files blank except for bearings. But the sea did not forget. It never does. It keeps ledgers. And some ledgers are not for balancing but for waiting. So Alaska B waits. In the wrinkle beyond the headland, in the taste of copper at dawn, in the spin of compasses that briefly salute a bearing unmarked. She is the ledger's black line, the crown's weight, the silence between thunder and rain. And when the hinge returns, because it will, because the sea rehearses nothing it does not intend, she will rise again. Not to fight, not to finish, but to remind. That steel can be verdict, that absence can be presence, that history is only a draft and drafts are meant to be corrected. If you stand on that shore, alone in fog, you may hear the bell tolling subtraction. You may see the crown spin once. And you may feel the ledger open in your chest, pages heavy with words you never wrote but will be asked to sign. The ocean does not need you to believe. It only needs you to listen. And in the silence after, you will understand. Some ships are built, some are remembered, and some, like Alaska B, are neither. They are the shadow that measures us. The black crown above the mast. The wake still widening long after the vessel has gone.